Please, just shoot me, she said. The rancher pulled the trigger, and the crowd screamed. The Wyoming wind carried the scent of dust and dying dreams across the McKenna ranch as Sarah stood on the weathered porch, watching the last of her cattle graze in the distance. 6 months had passed since her father's funeral, and the weight of keeping his legacy alive pressed down on her shoulders like a yoke meant for stronger backs. "Miss McKenna," came a gravelly voice from behind her. She turned to see old Pete, her father's longtime foreman hat in his weathered hands. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper today, etched by worry and something that looked suspiciously like pity. "What is it, Pete?" Sarah asked, though she already knew. The answer was written in the way he shifted his weight, the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "We lost another dozen head last night. Found 'em down by Miller's Creek, all bearing fresh brands that ain't ours." Pete's voice was barely above a whisper. "That makes 43 this month, Miss Sarah. We can't keep bleeding cattle like this." Sarah's jaw tightened. She knew exactly whose brands those cattle would be wearing now. Marcus Blackwood owned half the territory and wanted the other half, including every acre of McKenna land. Her father had stood against him for 20 years, and now that burden fell to her. "Have you spoken to Sheriff Lawson?" she asked, though she already knew that answer too. Pete's laugh was bitter. "Sheriff's got himself a new deputy. Young fella named Thompson, rides real nice horses, expensive ones, the kind a deputy can't afford on his salary." Sarah understood. Blackwood's influence reached everywhere, contaminating everything it touched like poison in a well. The town that had once respected her father's name now watched her with calculating eyes, waiting to see how long the McKenna girl could hold out. The sound of approaching hooves broke through her thoughts. A lone rider emerged from the heat shimmer on the horizon, sitting easy in his saddle despite the grueling pace he must have kept to cover such distance. As he drew closer, Sarah could make out a tall frame and dark hair beneath a worn hat, everything about him speaking of a man who'd seen more than his share of hard country. "You expecting someone?" Pete asked, his hand instinctively moving toward the rifle propped against the porch rail. "No," Sarah replied, but something in her chest tightened with an emotion she couldn't name. Hope, maybe, or just the desperate wish that this stranger might be the answer to prayers she'd been too proud to voice. The rider approached with deliberate calm, stopping his horse 20 feet from the porch. Up close, Sarah could see he was younger than she'd first thought, maybe 30, with intelligent green eyes that took in everything without seeming to stare. His clothes were clean but worn, the kind of careful maintenance that spoke of a man with limited means, but unlimited pride. "Ma'am," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice was educated, carrying traces of the South but tempered by years of travel. "Name's James Coleman. I heard in town you might be looking for hands. Depends on what kind of work you're looking for," Sarah replied, fighting to keep the hope out of her voice. "Ranch work's hard and the pay's not much to speak of." Coleman dismounted with fluid grace, keeping his hands visible and his movements slow. Sarah noticed the gun on his hip was well maintained but not flashy, the holster positioned for use rather than show. "I've worked cattle from Texas to Montana, ma'am. I can ride, rope, and shoot well enough to keep wolves away from the herd, two-legged or otherwise." His eyes met hers directly. "As for pay, a man's got to eat, but I've found that working for good people is worth more than working for rich ones." Pete stepped forward, his experienced eye taking in the stranger's horse, gear, and bearing. "You got references?" "I do." Coleman reached slowly into his saddlebag and produced a folded letter. "This is from the Rocking W ranch up in Montana. Worked there 2 seasons. Sarah took the letter, aware of how close Coleman had to step to hand it to her. He smelled like leather and sage, and something indefinable that made her pulse quicken. The letter was genuine, praising Coleman's skill with horses and his steady character. "Why'd you leave Montana?" Pete asked, his foreman's suspicion still evident. For just a moment, something flickered behind Coleman's eyes. "Pain, maybe, or regret. Sometimes a man needs to move on," he said simply. "I heard Wyoming might be a good place for a fresh start." Sarah found herself studying his face, looking for the lies that experience had taught her to expect from drifters. Instead, she saw something that surprised her. Honesty. Not complete honesty, perhaps, but the kind of careful truth a man told when he was trying to leave his past behind without betraying his principles. "We can offer 30 a month plus board." she said, ignoring Pete's sharp look. It was more than they could afford, but something told her that James Coleman might be worth the risk. Work starts at dawn, ends when it's done. Sundays are yours unless there's an emergency. That's fair, ma'am, more than fair. Coleman extended his hand and Sarah took it. His grip was firm and calloused, the hand of a man who'd never been afraid of honest work. I won't let you down. As their hands touched, Sarah felt something electric pass between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. For a moment, the weight of the ranch, the pressure from Blackwood, and the fear of losing everything her father had built seemed to lift from her shoulders. Pete will show you to the bunkhouse and introduce you to the other hands, she said, reluctantly releasing his hand. We'll see what you're made of come morning. Coleman nodded and gathered his horse's reins. Thank you, Miss McKenna. You won't regret this. As she watched him walk away beside Pete, Sarah hoped he was right. The ranch needed help, and she needed hope. Maybe James Coleman could provide both. But as the wind picked up again, carrying whispers of change across the prairie, she couldn't shake the feeling that her decision would alter more than just the fate of the cattle. 3 weeks later, Sarah found herself watching James Coleman work with an admiration that had nothing to do with practical ranching needs. He moved among the horses like he was born to it, his voice low and steady as he gentled a particularly stubborn mare that had thrown 2 previous riders. Easy now, girl, Coleman murmured, his hand never leaving the horse's neck. Nobody's going to hurt you. We're just going to take this slow. Sarah leaned against the corral fence, mesmerized by the patience in his movements. In 3 weeks, he'd proven himself invaluable. The other hands had accepted him quickly, drawn by his competence and his willingness to take on the worst jobs without complaint. More importantly, he'd brought something to the ranch that had been missing since her father's death. Hope. He's got a gift with them horses, Pete said, joining her at the fence. Haven't seen anything like it since your daddy was young. Papa always said you could tell a man's character by how he treated animals, Sarah replied, not taking her eyes off Coleman as he swung into the saddle. The mare pranced nervously but didn't buck, responding to the calm confidence of her rider. Your daddy was a wise man. Pete's voice carried a note of warning. He also used to say that some gifts come with a price attached. Sarah glanced at her foreman. What do you mean? A man like Coleman doesn't drift into the territory by accident. He's running from something, or something's chasing him. Question is, which one is it? Before Sarah could respond, the sound of multiple horses approaching drew their attention. Marcus Blackwood rode into the yard flanked by 4 men, his expensive suit and polished boots a stark contrast to the working ranch around him. His pale eyes found Sarah immediately, and his smile was all teeth and no warmth. Miss McKenna, Blackwood said, dismounting with theatrical flourish. I hope you don't mind the intrusion, but I have a proposition that couldn't wait. Sarah straightened, her hand instinctively moving to the rifle she now kept closer since the cattle thefts had increased. Mr. Blackwood, to what do I owe the pleasure? Straight to business, I admire that in a woman. Blackwood's gaze swept over the ranch buildings, cataloging every sign of struggle. I'm prepared to make you a very generous offer for your land. $50,000, cash money, enough to set you up comfortably anywhere you'd like to go. And I'm prepared to give you the same answer I gave you last month and the month before that. Sarah's voice was steady despite the fury building in her chest. The ranch isn't for sale. Blackwood's smile never wavered, but something cold flickered in his eyes. Miss McKenna, I fear you don't fully understand your situation. The banknote your father signed comes due in 6 months. Without cattle to sell, how do you propose to make that payment? That's between me and the bank, Sarah replied, though his words hit like physical blows. The note was real, and the stolen cattle had put her in an impossible position. Ah, but you see, I purchased that note from the bank just yesterday. Blackwood reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. Which means the debt is now owed to me, and I'm afraid I'm not nearly as patient as old Mr. Henderson at the bank was. The world seemed to tilt around Sarah. Without that 6-month cushion, she had no hope of raising the money needed to keep the ranch. Blackwood had effectively trapped her, using her own desperation against her. You bastard, Pete growled, stepping forward. One of Blackwood's men, a scarred brute named Carson, dropped his hand to his gun. Old man, you might want to watch your tongue. The tension in the yard ratcheted up instantly, the kind of dangerous silence that preceded violence. Sarah could feel everything balanced on a knife's edge. One wrong word away from bloodshed that would solve nothing and cost everything. Is there a problem here? Coleman's voice cut through the tension like a cool breeze. He dismounted without anyone noticing, moving with the quiet efficiency that Sarah was beginning to recognize as his trademark. There was nothing threatening in his posture, but something about his presence made Blackwood's men shift uncomfortably. No problem, Blackwood said smoothly, though his eyes had sharpened with interest. Just conducting a bit of business with Miss McKenna. And you are? James Coleman. I work here. Ah, the new hand. Blackwood's smile returned. Predatory now. I don't suppose you've had much experience with business matters, Mr. Coleman, but perhaps you could explain to your employer the realities of her situation. Coleman's expression didn't change, but Sarah caught something dangerous flash in his green eyes. I've found that men who conduct business surrounded by gunmen usually aren't conducting honest business at all. Carson's face darkened. You got something to say about it, cowboy? Just an observation. Coleman's voice remained perfectly calm. Though I'm curious why a businessman would need 4 armed men to discuss a simple land transaction. The challenge hung in the air between them. Sarah held her breath, recognizing the moment for what it was. A test of wills that would determine how far Blackwood was willing to push his intimidation tactics. Blackwood studied Coleman for a long moment, then laughed. You're quite right, Mr. Coleman. Sometimes I let my enthusiasm for expansion cloud my judgment. He remounted his horse with fluid grace. Miss McKenna, my offer stands. $50,000 or the alternative when your note comes due. The choice, as always, is yours. As Blackwood and his men rode away, Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. Coleman moved to her side, his presence steadying without being presumptuous. You all right? He asked quietly. Sarah nodded, though she wasn't sure it was true. Thank you. For diffusing that situation, I mean. Men like Blackwood count on intimidation. Sometimes all it takes is someone willing to call their bluff. Coleman's eyes followed the dust cloud of the departing riders. Though I don't think he's done with you yet. No, Sarah agreed, the weight of her situation crushing down on her again. He's got me exactly where he wants me. Without those stolen cattle, I can't make the payment. And now he owns the note. Coleman was quiet for a moment, studying her face. How much time do you have? 6 months, maybe less if he decides to call it in early. That's enough time, Coleman said with quiet certainty. Enough time for what? For the first time since she'd known him, Coleman smiled. It transformed his entire face, revealing glimpses of the man he might have been before whatever had driven him to Wyoming. To show Mr. Blackwood that McKenna land isn't as easy to steal as he thinks. The moon hung like a silver dollar over the McKenna ranch as Sarah made her way to the barn, unable to sleep for the 3rd night running. The weight of Blackwood's ultimatum pressed against her chest like a stone, making every breath an effort. She'd spent hours staring at the ceiling of her father's old room, running numbers that never added up to salvation. Inside the barn, she found Coleman brushing down his horse by lamplight, his movements careful and methodical. He looked up as she entered, no surprise in his expression as if he'd been expecting her. Couldn't sleep either? She asked, settling onto a hay bale nearby. Sleep's overrated, Coleman replied, running the brush along his horse's flank. Besides, thunder here gets restless when storms are coming. Sarah glanced toward the barn doors. The night seemed calm enough, but she'd learned to trust the instincts of both animals and the men who worked with them. What kind of storm? Coleman paused in his brushing. The kind that changes everything. They worked in comfortable silence, Sarah organizing tack while Coleman tended to his horse. There was something intimate about sharing these quiet moments, a closeness that had nothing to do with proximity and everything to do with understanding. Over the past month, she'd found herself looking forward to these chance encounters, the way his presence seemed to steady the chaotic world around her. James, she said finally, using his first name for the first time. What Pete said about you running from something, is it true? Coleman's hands stilled on the brush. For a moment, Sarah thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, measured. Every man's got things in his past he'd rather leave behind. That's not an answer. He turned to face her, lamplight casting shadows across his features. What do you want to know, Sarah? The sound of her name on his lips sent warmth through her chest. I want to know if I can trust you. Really trust you. Coleman set down the brush and moved closer, close enough that she could see the conflict playing out in his green eyes. My real name is James Colton, not Coleman. He paused as if the words cost him something precious. 3 years ago, I was a deputy marshal in Kansas. Good at my job, maybe too good. Sarah's breath caught. A lawman. That explained the way he carried himself, the controlled competence that marked him as different from ordinary ranch hands. There was a man named William Cross, Coleman continued, his voice growing harder. Rich, powerful, connected to politicians and judges. He owned half of Dodge City, including most of the law. But he also ran guns to hostile tribes and sold whiskey to reservation Indians. People died because of him. Good people. What happened? I gathered evidence, built a case, had him dead to rights. Coleman's jaw tightened. The night before the trial, my witness disappeared. The judge dismissed all charges. Cross walked away laughing. Sarah could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of a justice denied. So you left? I should have. Instead, I did something stupid. Coleman ran a hand through his dark hair. I confronted Cross outside his saloon, called him out in front of half the town. He went for his gun, and I killed him. The words hung between them like smoke. Sarah felt her world tilt slightly, trying to reconcile the gentleman she'd come to know with the image of a killer. It was self-defense, Coleman said quickly. But Cross had friends in high places. They put a bounty on my head, $5,000 dead or alive. I've been running ever since. Sarah studied his face, looking for deception and finding only weary honesty. Why are you telling me this? Because Blackwood's been asking questions about me in town. Sooner or later, someone's going to recognize my name. And when that happens, I'll have to leave. His eyes met hers. I don't want to leave you to face this alone, but I may not have a choice. The thought of losing him hit Sarah like a physical blow. Somewhere over the past weeks, James Coleman, or Colton, had become more than just another ranch hand. He'd become her anchor in a storm that threatened to sweep away everything she held dear. There might be another way, she said, her mind racing. Sarah. No, listen. She stood pacing the small space between the stalls. You said Cross was selling guns to hostile tribes. That's a federal crime, which means there might be federal warrants, federal jurisdiction. If we could prove that the bounty on your head is connected to federal crimes. It's too dangerous, Coleman interrupted. These men don't just kill witnesses, they destroy anyone who might become a witness. I won't risk your life for my problems. Sarah stopped pacing and faced him. What if it's not just about your problems anymore? Before he could ask what she meant, the barn door burst open. Pete stood silhouetted against the moonlight, his rifle in his hands and urgency written across his weathered features. Miss Sarah, we got trouble. Big trouble. What is it? Found something down by the creek. You both need to see this. They followed Pete through the darkness, their boots crunching on frost-crisp grass. The creek ran along the southern boundary of McKenna land, a natural border that had stood unchallenged for 20 years. Now, in the moonlight, Sarah could see fresh survey stakes driven into the ground, yellow ribbons fluttering like warning flags. Blackwood's having the land resurveyed, Pete said grimly. But look at this. He led them to a pile of stones that had been scattered, the remains of an old boundary marker. This marker's been here since your granddaddy's time. Survey shows the creek as the boundary, but these new stakes put it 50 yards into McKenna land. Sarah knelt beside the scattered stones, her heart sinking. He's going to claim the boundary was always farther north. With a new survey to back him up, he can seize the land legally, Coleman finished. Even if you made the loan payment, he could tie you up in court for years fighting the boundary dispute. And during that time, his cattle would graze on McKenna grass. His men would patrol McKenna roads, Pete added bitterly. Possession being 9/10 of the law and all. Sarah stood, fury and desperation warring in her chest. Blackwood had outmaneuvered her at every turn, anticipating her moves and cutting off her options one by one. The walls were closing in, and she was running out of both time and hope. There's something else, Pete said reluctantly. Saw riders earlier heading toward town. One of them looked like he might have been asking about our new hand here. Coleman's face went stone cold. How many riders? 3, maybe 4. Professional types, if you catch my meaning. Bounty hunters. Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. Just when she needed Coleman most, when his presence had become as essential to her as breathing, his past was catching up to both of them. I have to go. Coleman said quietly. Tonight, before they figure out where I am. No. The word tore from Sarah's throat with surprising force. We'll figure something out. There has to be another way. Coleman moved closer, his hands framing her face with heartbreaking gentleness. Sarah, these men will kill anyone who gets in their way. I won't let that happen to you. And I won't let you face this alone, she whispered, covering his hands with her own. For a moment they stood frozen in moonlight and possibility, two people who'd found something precious just as the world conspired to tear it away. Then Coleman leaned down and kissed her, soft and desperate and full of goodbye. When they broke apart, Sarah saw her own desperation reflected in his eyes. Promise me something, she whispered. Anything. Don't leave without saying goodbye. Whatever happens, don't just disappear. Coleman nodded, though something in his expression made her heart clench with premonition. As they walked back toward the ranch house, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that she was living through the last peaceful moments of her old life, that tomorrow would bring changes that would alter everything forever. She was right. The town square of Cedar Ridge buzzed with an energy that had nothing to do with the autumn cattle market. Word had spread like wildfire through the dusty streets. The McKenna girl was making her stand today, and Marcus Blackwood wasn't backing down. By noon, half the territory had gathered to witness what everyone knew would be the final confrontation. Sarah stood on the steps of the courthouse, her father's rifle heavy in her hands and heavier still in her heart. 3 days had passed since that night by the creek. 3 days of careful planning and desperate hope. Coleman had kept his promise. He hadn't left without saying goodbye. But the goodbye he'd given her at dawn had been filled with such finality that she'd known, even as she'd kissed him one last time, that he never expected to see her again. Now she faced Blackwood across 50 yards of packed earth, the space between them charged with the electricity of impending violence. He stood beside his gleaming black carriage, flanked by his usual complement of hired guns, his smile as cold and sharp as winter steel. "Miss McKenna," Blackwood called out, his voice carrying easily across the square. "I had hoped you would come to your senses before it came to this." "The only thing that makes sense," Sarah replied, her voice steadier than she felt, "is stopping you from stealing what doesn't belong to you." A murmur rippled through the crowd. They'd all heard rumors about the forged survey, the bought judges, the calculated campaign to destroy the McKenna legacy. Some sympathized, but sympathy didn't pay bills or stop bullets. "Stealing?" Blackwood laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "My dear girl, everything I've done has been perfectly legal. The survey clearly shows that creek bottom land belongs to me, has always belonged to me. Your father simply chose to ignore the proper boundaries." "You lying snake," Pete shouted from somewhere in the crowd. "That marker's been there 40 years. Blackwood's smile widened. Old markers can be unreliable, particularly when they were placed by men with more ambition than accuracy. He gestured toward the courthouse. "Judge Morrison has reviewed all the evidence and signed the appropriate orders. The land is mine, Miss McKenna. The only question is whether you'll leave peacefully or in a pine box." Sarah felt the crowd's mood shift around her like a living thing. Fear began to override sympathy as people remembered who held the real power in Cedar Ridge. Some began to drift away, unwilling to be caught in the crossfire when words inevitably gave way to bullets. "There's just one problem with your plan, Blackwood." The voice came from behind Sarah, and she spun around to see Coleman emerging from the courthouse, a sheaf of papers in his left hand, and his right resting easily on his gun. Her heart leaped and plummeted simultaneously, joy at seeing him alive, warring with terror at what his presence meant. "James, no," she whispered, but he was already moving past her, down the courthouse steps toward the center of the square. Blackwood's composure cracked slightly. "Mr. Coleman, I was told you'd left our fair territory. Something about outstanding warrants?" "Oh, I had every intention of leaving," Coleman said, his voice carrying the easy confidence Sarah had come to love. "But then I got curious about those federal marshals who've been asking questions around town. Seems they weren't looking for me after all." He held up the papers, and Sarah could see official seals glinting in the afternoon sun. "Turns out the U.S. Marshal's office has been building quite a case against a certain businessman. Gun running, whiskey trading with hostile tribes, bribing federal officials. Fascinating reading, really." Blackwood's face had gone pale beneath his perfectly groomed mustache. "Those are forgeries." Desperate lies from a wanted man. That's what I thought too, Coleman agreed pleasantly. Until Marshal Hendricks explained that William Cross, before I killed him, had been very cooperative with federal investigators. Named names, provided dates, even sketched out delivery routes. He smiled, and it was nothing like the gentle expressions Sarah had seen from him. This smile belonged to the lawman he'd once been, cold and implacable as justice itself. Seems Cross was hoping to avoid federal prison by testifying against his business partners. Partners like you, Marcus. The crowd stirred restlessly. Federal crimes meant federal jurisdiction, federal judges who couldn't be bought with local money and local influence. Suddenly Marcus Blackwood didn't seem quite so untouchable. You're bluffing. Blackwood snarled, but Sarah could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. Maybe I am. Coleman shrugged. But Marshal Hendricks is waiting in the hotel right now, along with a federal judge and enough evidence to hang you 3 times over. Funny how your hired guns suddenly don't look so eager when they realize they might be facing federal murder charges. Indeed, Blackwood's men were shifting nervously, hands moving away from their weapons as they realized the stakes had changed. Local law could be bought or intimidated, but federal law was a different animal entirely. Blackwood's eyes darted around the square, calculating odds and options. Sarah could see him weighing his choices. Surrender and face federal justice, or fight and risk everything on one desperate gamble. Even if that's true, Blackwood said finally, his voice rising to address the crowd, it doesn't change the facts about the McKenna land. The survey is legitimate, the boundaries are clear. This is still a local matter, not a federal one. Actually, a new voice interjected, that's not quite accurate. A tall man in a dark suit emerged from the crowd, a silver star glinting on his chest. Marshal Hendricks moved with the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed, his pale eyes taking in the scene with professional interest. Mr. Blackwood, Hendricks said conversationally, federal law takes a dim view of using forged documents to steal land, particularly when that land contains mineral rights that have been promised to foreign investors. Seems you've been busy selling mining claims to English businessmen for territory you don't actually own. Sarah felt the world shift around her. Mineral rights? Foreign investors? The scope of Blackwood's scheme was far larger than anyone had imagined. Blackwood's composure finally shattered completely. This is a setup, a conspiracy to destroy an honest businessman. The only conspiracy here, Hendricks replied calmly, is the one you've been running for the past 5 years. Gun running, fraud, murder. Quite an impressive list of federal crimes, Mr. Blackwood. The crowd began to back away as the tension in the square ratcheted to dangerous levels. Sarah could see Blackwood's hand creeping toward his gun, desperation replacing calculation in his eyes. A cornered animal was always the most dangerous. Sarah, Coleman said quietly, not taking his eyes off Blackwood, you need to step back now. Instead, Sarah moved forward, positioning herself between Coleman and Blackwood's remaining gunmen. Please, Marcus, she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent square. Just give up. You've lost. Don't make this worse by getting people killed. Give up? Blackwood laughed wildly. Give up everything I've built? Everything I've worked for? His hand closed around his gun butt. I'd rather see it all burn first. Please, Sarah whispered. And in that word was everything. Her fear for Coleman, her desperation to save lives, her exhaustion with the violence that seemed to follow men like shadows. Just shoot me. The words hung in the air like a physical presence. Every eye in the square fixed on her as she stood there unarmed and unafraid, offering her life to prevent the bloodshed she knew was coming. Blackwood's gun cleared leather, the metal glinting in the afternoon sun as it swung toward Sarah's heart. But before he could pull the trigger, another gun roared from behind her. James Coleman's bullet took Marcus Blackwood in the center of his chest, spinning him around and dropping him into the dust of the street he'd tried so hard to control. The echo of the gunshot rolled across the silent square like thunder, final and absolute. Sarah turned to see Coleman holstering his smoking pistol, his face calm but his hands trembling slightly. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I know you wanted it to end differently. He made his choice, Sarah replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her own voice. We all did. Marshal Hendricks moved forward to check Blackwood's body while his deputies rounded up the remaining gunmen. The crowd began to disperse, the show over and the excitement fading into the ordinary business of living. As the sun began to set over Cedar Ridge, Sarah and Coleman stood together in the courthouse square, watching the last of the spectators drift away. The McKenna Ranch was safe. The federal charges would ensure that Blackwood's criminal enterprise died with him, and the boundary dispute would be resolved in favor of the original markers. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked. Coleman smiled, and this time it was the gentle expression she'd fallen in love with. "Now we go home. We rebuild the herd, we work the land, and we see what the future brings." "We?" Sarah felt her heart skip. "If you'll have me." The federal charges against me were dropped when I agreed to testify about Cross's activities. Turns out killing a criminal who was already marked for federal prosecution isn't quite the crime I thought it was. Sarah reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining naturally. "I think the McKenna Ranch could use a good foreman, someone who knows how to handle both horses and federal marshals." As they walked toward their horses, Sarah thought about her father and the legacy he'd left her. The land was important, but it wasn't everything. Sometimes the most valuable thing a person could leave behind wasn't property or money, but the courage to stand up for what was right, no matter the cost. The McKenna name would endure, carried forward not just by blood but by the choices made in dusty courthouse squares when the world demanded heroes and ordinary people found the strength to answer that call. Behind them, the wind scattered dust over the place where Marcus Blackwood had fallen, already beginning the process of erasing him from a town that had never really been his to begin with. What did you think of Sarah and James's incredible journey from desperation to triumph? Did the shocking courthouse confrontation leave you on the edge of your seat? We'd love to hear your thoughts about this tale of love, courage, and justice in the comments below. If you enjoyed this gripping story of the Old West, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories that will keep you captivated from beginning to end. Your support means everything to us, and it helps us bring you more amazing content like this. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.